There are moments when a family story crosses a line, not because of new charges, not because of a court filing, not because of another viral clip, but because someone inside the family says something that was never meant to be public. This was one of those moments. The Whittaker story has already carried poverty, addiction, alleged exploitation, state intervention, and public division. Most people watching think they've heard every possible revelation. Then BJ opened her mouth, and the conversation changed. It wasn't polished. It wasn't scripted. It wasn't filtered through a documentary lens. It was raw, defensive, emotional, and deeply personal. She said she had been falsely accused of abusing her aunt, her uncle, and her cousin. She said she would never hurt them. She said she hasn't been sleeping. She said she hears them hollering for her at night. And then she said the sentence that shifted everything. I don't appreciate what Eric and Patrick put out there about me. And one thing that really pissed me off is when Eric said that my dad raped me, 'cause it never happened. Yes, I was, but not by my dad. And then she named someone else. That's the moment the story stopped being internet drama and started being generational trauma unfolding in public. Because when someone says, yes, I was, there is no sarcasm there. There is no punchline. There is no gossip value. There is damage. And damage inside families like this doesn't happen in isolation. It compounds. The Whittakers are already known as a family marked by genetic complications, poverty, and isolation. But abuse allegations, even spoken informally, even without court documentation, change the emotional architecture of the story. It forces people to look at the past differently. BJ didn't deny being assaulted. She denied who did it. That distinction matters, and it opens uncomfortable questions. If she is telling the truth, then a serious accusation was publicly attached to the wrong person. If she is lying, then she is weaponizing trauma to deflect blame. Those are not small possibilities. They are heavy ones. And here is the difficult reality. Addiction complicates credibility. BJ openly acknowledged struggling with substance use. She admitted being an addict. She said she is working on sobriety. That admission can build trust, or it can make skeptics louder. People often say addicts lie. Sometimes they do. Sometimes they lie to protect their access to drugs. Sometimes they lie to avoid consequences. Sometimes they lie because shame distorts memory. But here's what experts also say. Addicts also tell the truth, especially when it hurts them to do so. And sexual abuse is not a glamorous lie to invent. It is a wound. So when BJ says, yes, I was, the responsible response is not immediate dismissal. It's caution, because the internet does something dangerous when it hears trauma. It ranks it, it measures it, it debates it, it decides which version is more entertaining. That's not justice. That's spectacle. And spectacle is what this family has been drowning in for years. There is another layer here. BJ claims she has been falsely accused of abusing her aunt, uncle, and cousin. That allegation matters in context, because after Adult Protective Services intervened in the Whittaker household, public narratives hardened quickly. Someone had to be responsible. Someone had to be the villain. In chaotic families dealing with addiction, neglect, and poverty, blame moves fast, and it rarely lands gently. If BJ feels scapegoated, that would explain the tone of her video. Defensive, wounded, frustrated. But there's another possibility. What if multiple things are true at once? What if BJ both struggled with addiction and experienced trauma? What if she harmed and was harmed? What if dysfunction inside the family didn't begin with her generation, but was inherited? That's the uncomfortable truth about generational trauma. It rarely has one villain. It spreads. The name she mentioned, Uncle Michael, is not publicly documented in a court filing connected to this case, at least not in widely reported records. It appears only in her statement. That means we cannot treat it as a proven fact. We can only treat it as an allegation made by the person claiming harm. And that's where discipline matters, because repeating names without verification becomes defamation, and ignoring disclosures becomes cruelty. So the only responsible path is this. Acknowledge what she said. Separate it from what has been legally confirmed. Avoid turning it into entertainment. There is also the question of motive. Why say this now? Why in response to conflict with Eric and Patrick? Trauma disclosures sometimes happen when someone feels cornered, when identity feels threatened, when reputation feels destroyed, when someone believes they have nothing left to lose. But trauma can also be used as a shield, and the internet is terrible at telling the difference. That's why this moment is bigger than BJ. It exposes how the Whittaker story has evolved. What began as documentary compassion became viral fascination. What became viral fascination turned into financial controversy. What turned into financial controversy escalated into criminal investigations. And now, in the middle of all that, buried trauma surfaces. This is what happens when private families become public property. Secrets don't stay contained. They leak. They detonate. They ripple. And every time something new surfaces, viewers ask the wrong question. Is she lying? The better question is, what does this say about the environment this family has lived in for decades? Because abuse allegations do not appear in healthy ecosystems. They appear where boundaries were weak, where oversight was absent, where poverty and isolation insulated harm. If BJ was assaulted, that means there was no protection. If she wasn't, that means there is reckless accusation happening publicly. Either scenario is catastrophic. And here's the quiet tragedy. Lorraine, Timmy, Ray, they cannot speak easily for themselves. Their vulnerabilities were visible. BJ's vulnerability was not. Addiction hides trauma. Shame hides history. Silence hides patterns. So when she said it out loud, whether strategically or emotionally, the story expanded. And once expanded, it cannot shrink back. Now, the public holds something it never needed to hold. A disclosure. The responsible response is not amplification. It is restraint. But restraint doesn't go viral. That's the tension. The Whittakers didn't need this out. But BJ said it anyway. And now the story moves into territory that isn't about money, fines, investigations, or YouTube rivalries. It's about what happened behind closed doors long before cameras ever showed up. Comment carefully. Do you believe her? Do you think trauma is being weaponized? Or do you think we are witnessing generational damage finally surfacing? One word: truth, lie, or complicated. Because in families like this, it's rarely simple. When BJ said, "Yes, I was, but not by my dad," she didn't just correct a rumor. She redirected a narrative. And narratives are power in this story. For months, even years, the Whittaker saga has revolved around who exploited whom. Was it financial exploitation, emotional manipulation, internet clout, mismanagement of donations, criminal conduct, state overreach? Now, layered over all of that is something more volatile. Sexual abuse inside a family already defined by vulnerability. To understand why this moment matters, you have to separate three things. What has been legally documented? What has been publicly alleged? What has been emotionally disclosed? Those are not the same category. There is no publicly verified court ruling attached to BJ's statement about being assaulted by Uncle Michael. At least, none that has surfaced in reporting connected to the Whittaker investigations. That doesn't mean it didn't happen. It means it hasn't been legally confirmed in the record the public has seen. And that distinction matters. Because once something is said online, especially in a high-profile family, it spreads faster than context can keep up. The second layer here is the accusation she pushed back against. She claimed that Eric said her father raped her. That's a serious allegation. If someone publicly attributed sexual assault to the wrong person, that's reputational destruction. If someone misquoted, misunderstood, or distorted her history, that's another kind of damage. If she's correcting the record, that's all right. But if she's reframing a story to protect someone else or to shield herself from scrutiny, that's manipulation. And again, the internet is not equipped to distinguish those in real time. There's another uncomfortable angle here. Families that experience extreme poverty and isolation often develop internal hierarchies of silence. Things happen. People know. Nobody says. Why? Because survival becomes the priority. When resources are scarce, when there's no transportation, no stable income, no consistent access to therapy, law enforcement, or social services, reporting abuse doesn't feel like an option. It feels like risk. If the alleged abuser is a family member, reporting can mean homelessness. It can mean retaliation. It can mean social exile in a small community. So silence becomes currency. And if BJ's claim is true, then her disclosure isn't random. It's delayed. But delayed disclosures also raise questions. Why now? Why during public conflict? Why in the middle of internet battles involving Patrick, Eric, and others? Why when accusations against her are intensifying? There are psychological explanations for that timing. When people feel attacked, they often reach for origin stories. They say, "You don't understand what I've been through." It's not always manipulation. Sometimes it's context. But context offered in defense is always viewed with suspicion. That's human nature. Now layer addiction on top. BJ admitted struggling with substance use. She acknowledged being an addict. She stated she is working on sobriety. Addiction and trauma are deeply intertwined. Studies consistently show that individuals with substance use disorders have significantly higher rates of childhood sexual abuse than the general population. Trauma often precedes addiction. Self-medication is common. Shame compounds secrecy. So when BJ links her history to assault, it fits a psychological pattern. That does not prove her claim, but it makes it plausible in a clinical sense. And plausibility is different from proof. This is where the public often collapses nuance. They think in binaries. She's an addict. She lies. Or, she's a victim. Believe her. Reality is rarely that clean. Addicts can be victims. Victims can cause harm. Harm can exist without a clear villain. The Whittaker family system appears to have been deeply enmeshed. Generations living on the same land. Intermarriage. Genetic complications. Limited outside oversight. Few structural boundaries. In those ecosystems, abuse can hide in plain sight. It can also be misremembered, misinterpreted, or misassigned. Memory is not a recording device, especially traumatic memory. It fragments. It distorts. It protects the psyche from unbearable details. That doesn't mean victims are lying. It means trauma alters perception and recall. Now, consider the collateral damage of her statement. If her father was publicly accused by someone else of raping her, and she says that is false, then that accusation harms not only him, but the broader family narrative. If she was assaulted by another relative and that person is deceased or absent, accountability becomes impossible. Which leaves what? Public judgment. And public judgment without legal process is chaos. There's another dimension here. BJ said she feels like she hears her aunt, uncle, and cousin calling for her at night. That line matters. It suggests guilt. It suggests grief. It suggests unresolved attachment. It does not automatically suggest innocence or guilt regarding alleged abuse within the household, but it signals psychological distress. Sleep disturbance is common in both trauma survivors and people experiencing withdrawal or substance instability. Again, two possibilities can exist simultaneously. This is why the most dangerous reaction is simplification. If viewers reduce her to drug addict liar, they miss the structural factors that created her environment. If viewers reduce her to pure victim, they ignore potential accountability issues raised in other parts of the Whittaker story. Both extremes flatten complexity. The more responsible approach is layered. Ask, is there corroboration? Is there documented history? Is there a pattern of consistent statements? Is there motive to fabricate? Is there motive to suppress? And then hold those questions without rushing to conclusion. There's also the impact on the siblings currently under state care. Lorraine, Timmy, Ray, they cannot publicly confirm or deny family history. They cannot contextualize. They cannot explain. Which means every new disclosure shifts public perception of their past without their participation. That's heavy, because trauma narratives, once public, become permanent. And even if disproven later, they linger. So what is the responsible takeaway from BJ's statement? First, it exposes the possibility that harm inside this family extends beyond financial disputes and internet drama. Second, it highlights how quickly public commentary can distort deeply personal history. Third, it reminds viewers that the Whittaker saga is not a contained story about poverty. It is a multi-generational trauma system. Fourth, it forces a re-evaluation of how YouTube creators speak about vulnerable people. If someone publicly speculated or stated that BJ's father assaulted her without airtight documentation, that is reckless. If BJ is now misdirecting blame, that is also reckless. But neither scenario justifies turning her disclosure into spectacle. The internet has a pattern. It consumes trauma. It debates trauma. It monetizes trauma. It moves on. The person who disclosed it stays behind. That's the asymmetry. And here's the final uncomfortable layer. If BJ is telling the truth, then for decades, a vulnerable young woman in a deeply isolated, impoverished family experienced sexual violence and received no institutional protection. That is not just a family failure. That is a systemic failure. Rural isolation, lack of reporting pathways, lack of mandated oversight, lack of intervention until cameras appeared. If she is not telling the truth, then we're watching trauma language being used strategically in a high-conflict environment. That, too, signals dysfunction. Either path leads back to the same core issue. This family has lived without stable protective structure for generations. And when structure fails long enough, chaos becomes normal. Now the question shifts to you. When someone in a controversial family discloses trauma during conflict, how should the public respond? Immediate belief? Immediate skepticism? Or cautious acknowledgement without amplification? Comment one word. Believe. Question. Or withhold. Because the way viewers respond determines whether this becomes healing or another cycle of exploitation. When trauma enters a public story, the rules change. Up until now, much of the Whittaker narrative has revolved around money, access, alleged exploitation, investigations, and online conflict between creators. Those are messy, but they're transactional. They can be tracked through receipts, filings, timelines, and documented exchanges. Sexual abuse is different. It doesn't sit neatly in a spreadsheet. It doesn't come with wire transfers and screenshots. It often exists in silence, memory, and shame. So when BJ named Uncle Michael, the conversation shifted from who controlled donations to who controlled bodies. And that's not just a dramatic turn. It's a structural one. Because once you introduce alleged sexual abuse into a family system already marked by genetic isolation, intellectual disability, poverty, addiction, and public spectacle, you're no longer looking at a chaotic story. You're looking at a layered vulnerability environment. Let's slow this down. There are three possible realities operating at once. BJ was assaulted by a relative and carried that trauma without protection. BJ is disclosing something partially true but distorted by memory, addiction, or conflict. BJ is using a traumatic claim defensively during public pressure. The public does not have enough verified documentation to conclusively determine which of those is true. That is the honest position. But what we can examine is impact. If BJ was assaulted, what does that say about the Whittaker family environment during her childhood? It suggests a setting where supervision was limited, where outside oversight was minimal, where intellectual limitations and poverty reduced protective barriers, where reporting mechanisms were likely unclear or inaccessible. And here is the uncomfortable extension of that thought. If one vulnerable member was unprotected, what does that imply about others? Lorraine, Timmy, Ray. When you study multigenerational trauma in isolated rural families, you see patterns. Isolation reduces witnesses. Poverty reduces exit options. Disability reduces advocacy. Addiction reduces stability. Abuse, when it occurs in such systems, often goes unreported for decades. Not because it didn't happen, because there was nowhere for it to go. But there's another angle that demands equal scrutiny. The timing. BJ's disclosure did not come during a quiet moment of healing. It came during public accusations against her. It came while she was defending herself against claims of abuse or financial misconduct. It came amid disputes involving Eric, Patrick, and others. Timing matters. When trauma is disclosed in the middle of conflict, observers question motive. That doesn't invalidate trauma, but it complicates interpretation, because human beings often reveal their deepest wounds when they feel cornered. Sometimes that revelation is authentic. Sometimes it is strategic. Sometimes it is both. Psychologically, trauma can resurface under stress. When someone feels attacked, old wounds reopen. When someone is publicly shamed, unresolved harm becomes salient. When someone's credibility is questioned, they may reveal context they've hidden. So the disclosure could be reactive, not manipulative. But public reaction tends to flatten that nuance. People want clean categories. She's lying. She's telling the truth. She's a victim. She's dangerous. Real life is not that binary. And here's the broader issue. The Whittaker family became a viral phenomenon years ago. Millions of people watched them through documentary footage. They reacted to unusual behaviors. They commented on living conditions. They debated ethics. They donated money. But very few asked a different question. What happens when you place a family with deep trauma history into global exposure without therapeutic scaffolding? Exposure does not equal healing. Attention does not equal support. Money does not equal structure. If BJ grew up in a household marked by genetic complexity, intellectual disability, financial instability, and alleged abuse, then the internet did not enter a neutral environment. It entered a trauma ecosystem. And trauma ecosystems do not stabilize under spotlight. They destabilize. Now consider another layer. BJ corrected the accusation about her father. She said he did not assault her. She redirected blame to another relative. If someone publicly misattributed sexual violence to the wrong person, that is not a small mistake. That is defamation territory. If Eric or anyone else made a public statement implying her father assaulted her without evidence, that is deeply irresponsible. Accusations of incest or rape inside a rural family already stigmatized by inbreeding narratives are explosive. The Whittakers have been labeled the most inbred family in America. That phrase has circulated for years. It is dehumanizing. It reduces individuals to genetic caricatures. It invites voyeurism, adds sexual assault allegations into that environment, and you create something combustible. Because now the story feeds into pre-existing stereotypes. Of course, something like that happened. Look at that family. That reaction is dangerous. It turns trauma into confirmation bias, which is why documentation matters. If there are police reports, court filings, or historical records connected to BJ's allegation, they have not been widely presented in connection to the current controversy. If they're not, then the public is operating on testimony alone. Testimony deserves respect, but testimony is not automatically proof. And here is where the conversation becomes uncomfortable again. Addiction. BJ acknowledged substance abuse. She said she is working on sobriety. Addiction does not erase trauma. It does not automatically create false memories, but it does complicate credibility in public perception. That is an unfair but real dynamic. Viewers often distrust addicts reflexively. They assume deception. They assume manipulation. Yet addiction is often rooted in trauma. Studies consistently show elevated rates of childhood sexual abuse among women with substance use disorders. So dismissing her because she has used drugs is intellectually lazy. But blindly accepting everything without verification is equally reckless. There is a third impact that hasn't been discussed enough. The impact on the siblings under care. Lorraine, Timmy, and Ray are not online debating this. They cannot issue clarifications. They cannot contextualize family history. They cannot protect their own narratives. Every new allegation reshapes public understanding of their upbringing, and they have no voice in that process. This is what happens when trauma narratives go public without structural containment. They become part of a permanent digital record, even if later disproven, even if later clarified, even if misinterpreted. Once it's out, it lives. So what should the responsible public response be? Not amplification, not dismissal, not sensational framing. It should be containment and caution. Ask for documentation. Avoid spreading unverified names. Avoid attaching allegations to individuals without proof. Avoid turning family trauma into entertainment. There's a deeper systemic lesson here. The Whittaker story keeps revealing something larger than individual conflict. It reveals what happens when vulnerable families fall between systems, when schools don't intervene, when health services don't monitor, when social services don't stabilize, when poverty isolates, when disability reduces advocacy. By the time the internet notices, the damage is decades old. And the internet is not a therapeutic institution. It is not a court. It is not a trauma center. It is a spectacle engine, which means every revelation risks becoming fuel. Now step back. If BJ is telling the truth, she lived with unaddressed sexual trauma in a family already struggling with survival. If she's not telling the truth, then trauma language is being deployed inside a volatile ecosystem for defensive positioning. Either scenario indicates dysfunction, and dysfunction in this context is not entertainment. It's structural neglect, because families do not become this fragmented overnight. They become this way when intervention arrives too late. The most dangerous outcome here is not whether viewers believe BJ. The most dangerous outcome is if the story shifts entirely to scandal and away from systemic vulnerability, because then the cycle repeats. Shock, outrage, views, monetization, silence, and the people at the center remain unstable. So now the question becomes more complex. When a trauma disclosure intersects with public controversy, what is the ethical responsibility of content creators? Should they A. replay it for engagement? B. frame it as explosive revelation? C. slow it down and treat it as sensitive testimony? D. avoid it altogether? Comment one letter. Because the way creators handle this determines whether the Whittaker story becomes healing or just another digital spectacle. There's a moment in every public controversy when the story stops being about facts and starts being about gravity. Gravity pulls everything toward extremes, toward scandal, toward outrage, toward sides. BJ's statement did not land in a vacuum. It landed in a community already split between supporters and critics of Eric, Patrick, and other creators orbiting the Whittaker family. It landed in a space where accusations of exploitation, financial mismanagement, and manipulation were already circulating. It landed in a digital environment that rewards emotional spikes. So what happens when trauma enters that gravity field? It gets pulled into arguments that were never about it, pulled into narratives it doesn't belong to, pulled into battles between personalities. And that is where real harm can multiply, because sexual abuse allegations are not rhetorical weapons. They are not strategic shields. They are not plot twists. They are claims that carry psychological weight, legal implications, and lifelong consequences. If BJ was assaulted by a relative, that is a profound trauma. If her father was falsely accused by someone else, that is also profound harm. If names are being used inaccurately or irresponsibly, that is reputational damage with real-world impact. And once those names are spoken publicly, they don't disappear. This is the part people rarely consider. When someone says, Uncle Michael, the internet does not hear ambiguity. It hears identity. It starts searching. It starts matching last names. It starts connecting dots that may or may not belong together. Digital crowds investigate aggressively. They rarely investigate responsibly. And the Whittaker story already carries layers of stigma. For years, they have been framed through a genetic lens, repeatedly described as an example of extreme inbreeding in rural America. That framing alone has reduced them to biology in the eyes of millions. Add sexual trauma allegations into that framework, and the narrative shifts towards something darker, dysfunction as inevitability. That is a dangerous narrative, because it implies that abuse is somehow expected in isolated families with intellectual disability and poverty. It normalizes tragedy instead of interrogating it. And that is precisely why the conversation must slow down. Let's examine something carefully. The allegation BJ corrected involved her father. She said he did not assault her. That claim, that her father raped her, was allegedly put forward publicly by someone else. If that is accurate, then someone misrepresented a sexual assault allegation in a way that implicated the wrong person. That is not a small misstep. That is reputational destruction. Accusing someone of incest or rape without evidence is one of the most serious public allegations imaginable. And when those accusations are made in the context of a family already vulnerable to ridicule and scrutiny, the fallout multiplies. But there's a second layer. BJ's correction didn't simply remove her father from the narrative. It replaced him with another relative. So now, instead of one alleged offender, there is another named. And here is the difficult truth. When abuse allegations surface decades after the alleged event, without court records, police documentation, or corroborating evidence presented publicly, the situation becomes extremely fragile. Not because survivors shouldn't be believed, but because digital adjudication is not justice. The internet cannot conduct a proper investigation. It cannot cross-examine. It cannot gather forensic evidence. It cannot evaluate witness reliability. It can only amplify. And amplification without verification creates collateral damage. Now, consider the psychological dimension. Trauma memory is complicated. It can be fragmented. It can be suppressed. It can resurface in pieces. It can shift in clarity over time. Addiction can also complicate recall, but does not automatically invalidate it. What addiction does do is increase vulnerability to exploitation, vulnerability to manipulation, vulnerability to chaotic environments. So BJ exists in a layered identity. She is a member of a stigmatized rural family, a person who has acknowledged addiction, a woman alleging sexual assault, a public figure inside an online controversy. Each of those identities shapes how audiences perceive her, and perception in the digital age becomes verdict. Now step back and look at the wider Whittaker system. If BJ experienced sexual abuse within the extended family, what does that imply about supervision and protection within that environment? If Lorraine was also alleged to have been assaulted decades ago under similarly isolated conditions, what does that suggest about structural safeguards in that community? When multiple sexual abuse allegations appear within one extended family system, experts don't immediately jump to sensational conclusions. They ask structural questions. Were there mandatory reporters involved? Were schools aware? Was there medical oversight? Were social services engaged at any point? Was law enforcement ever contacted? If so, what happened? In rural America, particularly in economically depressed regions, oversight can be inconsistent. Access to mental health services can be limited. Cultural barriers can discourage reporting. Stigma can silence victims. That doesn't mean every allegation is automatically true, but it does mean the environment matters. And the Whittaker environment, by documented accounts, was one of isolation. Isolation is not abuse, but isolation can hide abuse. There is another dimension people are missing: the role of content creators in shaping narrative memory. When creators repeat allegations, even cautiously, they create digital permanence. Future viewers encounter the story as fact, not as developing testimony. Context erodes over time. 5 years from now, someone may search the Whittaker family and encounter headlines referencing assault allegations without understanding the uncertainty around them. That is how narrative fossilization happens. An unverified claim becomes permanent digital identity, and that affects everyone involved: the accused, the accuser, the extended family, future generations. This is why responsible framing matters. It is possible to report what was said without endorsing it. It is possible to analyze impact without declaring guilt. It is possible to discuss trauma without sensationalizing it. But that requires discipline. And discipline is not rewarded by algorithms. Outrage is. Here's the deeper risk in this specific situation. If BJ's allegation is true and unaddressed, it represents systemic failure. Failure of family protection, failure of community oversight, failure of institutional intervention. If it is false or distorted, it represents a different failure. Failure of responsible communication, failure of evidence standards, failure of careful reporting. Either way, something failed. And that is what makes this story heavier than it appears. Because the Whittaker saga keeps circling back to the same core theme. Vulnerability without structure invites chaos. Whether that vulnerability is financial, intellectual, physical, or psychological, the absence of stable systems creates openings. Openings for exploitation. Openings for misunderstanding. Openings for harm. Now, consider the siblings currently under state care. They cannot contextualize their family history publicly. They cannot respond. They cannot clarify. Every new layer of allegation further distances them from a narrative they do not control. And that may be the quietest tragedy here. The Whittaker story began as documentation of poverty and genetic isolation. It evolved into debates about exploitation and money. Now it includes sexual trauma allegations. At what point does the public ask whether continued exposure is helping or compounding harm? There's a threshold where transparency becomes intrusion. And that threshold is different when dealing with cognitively vulnerable individuals. The final piece to consider is accountability. If serious allegations are being made about sexual assault, about defamation, about exploitation, the proper venue is not live stream chat. It is legal channels, police reports, formal complaints, documentation, protective services, civil courts. The internet can spotlight issues. It cannot resolve them. When creators handle trauma allegations casually, they create two dangers. They risk re-traumatizing survivors, and they risk falsely damaging others. Both outcomes are unacceptable. So here is the real question part 4 forces us to confront. Should trauma disclosures inside highly vulnerable families be monetized content at all? Not hidden, not ignored, but handled with safeguards. Because if this becomes just another bombshell in a long-running saga, then the lesson will be lost. And the people at the center, BJ, Lorraine, Timmy, Ray, Betty, Larry, will continue to live inside narratives shaped by strangers. The Whittakers didn't want this out, but it's out. Now the responsibility shifts to creators, to viewers, to anyone choosing to amplify. Do we treat it as scandal, or do we treat it as testimony requiring care? Comment one word: care, or content. Thank you for watching this video. Click here to watch another video that might interest you.